The Creative Writer's Way.
Writing is fundamental. It is our way. From stories come history. From history comes belonging. From belonging comes a sense of where we were, where we are, and where we are going. This is the foundation of civilization.
This is Dr. Skylar Madison. Find your story at skylarmadison.com.
Hello, this is Dr. Skylar Madison. Welcome to The Creative Writer's Way, the shows I do about learning the secrets to unleash your creative genius with creative writing and taking your stories and writing to the next level. Today's show is advice for writers who want to get their stories told. We'll be speaking with Joe Fontana, a producer here in LA, who will discuss his perspective on the business, how he works with writers to create great stories. Joe will talk to you about what he believes Hollywood's looking for, how you can make your stories more commercially viable, and get the inside scoop. Welcome, Joe. Are you there?
Hi, Skylar. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'd like to start by asking you why you're in the film business and what attracted you to this field.
I'm in the film business predominantly because I'm a storyteller. I think we all carry stories throughout our lives, and I think that there just comes a time when you want to tell those stories. I chose to tell it to a wider audience. This is a second half of life endeavor for me. And so I feel that I have things to say, and I also want to help other people who have things to say. So I am a writer and a producer, and I focus predominantly on stories and on content. So that's my perspective on it, and luckily I think that's where the industry is going. There's a lot of emphasis on story, and I think everybody has stories to tell. It's just a matter of whether or not they decide to tell them, and I try and help.
Right. That's great. So when you say your perspective on story, can you give us a little insight on what you mean by that? Like what makes a story resonate for you?
Well, I think one of the first questions that I always ask writers, and I work with writers on a daily basis, all different types of writers. One of the first questions that I ask writers is, where is this story coming from? Is it something that is an experience you've lived? Is it an experience that you've witnessed? I think that's very important, and I think that's the foundation for most great stories. Things that have happened to you or have happened to people very close to you. That's the secret sauce. When you have those insights, those feelings, those experiences that other people just don't have. I can write about things that have happened to other people remotely, but I'm not there. I'm researching it. It doesn't have that extra layer of authenticity and feeling that only you can bring to it if, in fact, it's happened to you. So the first question I ask writers, where in you is this story coming from? And that, to me, is very important.
Well, I can see that. It makes it more real, and you're writing about what you know about. But then I would imagine you have to then take that material and, quote, unquote, turn it into a story. So do you want to give some insight into how that's done? Because we're not just telling real stories. We're also morphing it into a story.
Well, in my view, a story has a certain structure to it. A good story has a certain structure to it. And I tend to look at storytelling almost like the human body to a degree. There's a skeleton to every story. There's a hard spinal column, the ribs. There's a real hard piece to the story that is what everything else hangs off of. And to me, that has to do with a protagonist or the main driver of the action wanting something. They want to accomplish something. They want to do something. They want to get something. So they have a very specific goal in mind. And there is an antagonist or a group of antagonists trying to stop them. Okay, so the protagonist wants to achieve their goal. The antagonists want to stop them from achieving their goal. And you also have to ask the question about the stakes. Well, what happens if they don't get that goal? Okay, what is really at stake in this whole enterprise? So a protagonist with a definite goal, an antagonist who has motivation to try to stop them, and a clear understanding of what are the stakes involved. To me, that's the spinal column that your story hangs on. And everything that you write has to be in service to that in some way, shape, or form. If it's not in service to that, then it's just fat in the story, and you have to start cutting that out. So that's what I look for. Tell me the spinal column of your story. Tell me what it's all about. I also think you have to be able to relate to the protagonist. That's not always the case, but I think it's very helpful. You have to, in some way, like them, or in some way be interested in them, in some way be willing to...
Well, and let me just add, maybe empathize with them, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there are protagonists that are not likable that you might follow. I mean, there were stories like that. But I think that by and large, particularly in Western film, the protagonist is somebody who you want to relate to on some level. You want to empathize with. You want to feel like, oh, I'm going to go along for this 2-hour ride with this individual or group of individuals and see if they get what they want and what they need and what happens. And so that, to me, is the spinal column of the story, and everything else, has to be in service to that.
Excellent. Thank you. So what do you believe the film industry / TV industry is looking for today? We're dealing with more limited attention spans, and we're all still want to see stories, though. Can you give us some insight into what you think, where the industry is and what they're looking for?
I think that the industry is looking for content. I think now more so than ever before, there are more stories being told. The mix of how those stories are being told has changed considerably. The feature-length film has moved a lot more towards the tentpole, the big blockbuster, the Marvel comics and the Jumanjis and the Avatar type of formats, and so there are fewer films that are much more expensive being made. There's also independent films. But again, the production of independent films is down from a few years ago in the industry. So, to me, there are two formats, if you will. One is what I call the feature length, whether it's going to be a tentpole or whether it's going to be an independent film, or even if it's going to be made-to-TV or cable or streaming. It's still about 2 hours, and you have 2 hours to tell your story, okay? And as a writer, I don't think you should really be too concerned about where the film is going to be displayed. I mean, that's more the producer's job, I think, than the writer's job. The writer should focus on telling your story in about 2 hours, and that's definitely one type of writing. The other type is what's called cable, or used to be called TV. It's the episodic writing. It's you tell your stories in maybe 30 to 50-minute blocks over a period of seasons. Game of Thrones is probably the best example of that. You're following characters over 3, 4, 5 years with 10, 15, 20 episodes a year. So you're telling a story, but you're telling it in a different format. It tends to be a much longer, drawn-out character development type of thing. And it's definitely, having written both, it's definitely a different style of writing. It's much more character-driven when you're telling an episodic story. So the shape of your story really changes, and I think as a writer you have to pay attention to that. It's definitely a different style of writing.
Right. And what have been some of your favorite films and stories, and if you could shed some light on why that is?
Well, I think in addition to telling stories from your own personal experience, it's also important, don't forget, the storytelling, the filmmaking, whether it's for feature-length films or whether it's for streaming or television or however whatever the mode that your story is going to be told, you want to also make it commercially viable to a degree. And by commercially viable, I always look for things that are relevant to what people are talking about today. Okay, how is this story in some way relevant to the myriad of things that we have going on in our lives and in the world? And if it's relevant, a potential audience would be much more inclined to find it. Or to go see it. I'm interested in a story about this. I'm interested in a story about that. Okay, so you talk about, for example, the empowerment of women and women being portrayed in a different light. So that plays into Wonder Woman to a certain degree. That's a female that's cast in a different light than has been traditionally. So it's something that's in the zeitgeist. It's something that people are thinking about. It's something that people are talking about. And more importantly, it's something that people are interested in because at the end of the day, from a commercial perspective, you're asking them to spend money to come and see your product. Buy my product. Take a look at this movie. It's something that you should be interested in. So being in the zeitgeist, I think, is a very important aspect of storytelling. It's the relatability of the story to today's audience that's important.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point in terms of, for example, if you look at two of the largest box office draws, Avatar and Titanic, and underneath both of those stories really was a deeper message, perhaps, and something that is in the zeitgeist. So, and yet it was told as a story, and you wouldn't necessarily, it's not banging you on the head with any message. It's just there underneath.
Right, and I think another technique that's being used today that I like very much is one of perspective. So, for example, you see something like Wicked, which is just a retelling of the Wizard of Oz to a degree from the perspective of the Wicked Witch of the West. Okay, so in her mind, she's not this evil person. She's this person who's had some wrong done to her, or people have misinterpreted her. So it's the same story we've all seen told a certain way for years and years and years, and now all of a sudden you're telling it from a completely different perspective. You're telling it from the traditional antagonist perspective, and now she's the protagonist. Okay, she's the one that You're trying to see things from her point of view, and I think that's something that's popular to a degree. But I think the greater point there is there are a lot of perspectives on the same event. You've even seen some of these ensemble casts. I forget the name of the movie where there's a car accident, and it talks to 5 or 6 people and their perspective on that car accident because they were all involved in it in some way, shape, or form. So it's looking at an event, and instead of coming at it straight on from one perspective, it's coming at it from an alternative perspective or from multiple perspectives. Because, again, storytelling is really your perspective on what happened, right? I mean, it's your view of how this went down. It's not necessarily everybody's view. And so to the extent that there are a lot of stories that have been told, people say, oh, you can't tell a story because it's already been told. Yes, you can. You can tell it from a different perspective, or you can give it a fresh insight, or you can give it a little bit of a deeper meaning by taking some of the secondary themes and really exploring them. And I think that's the art of the writer. The writer looks at it and says, how do I see these events? How do I put these together? Okay, what's my belief system? and therefore what's my perspective on this story. So there's a lot of opportunity for different points of view on the same thing. And I think the hallmark of a good story is one that starts a conversation. When people leave the movie theater, to me, I'm a great judge. When I leave the movie theater, I like to listen to what people are talking about. Okay, are they talking about the movie? Are they talking about the characters? Are they talking about the performances? Or are they talking about where they're going to go for dinner or get a drink or something like that? At which point it's like, yeah, the movie didn't really capture them maybe that much. So you want to start a conversation. I think Avatar is a good example of that, a movie that started a variety of conversations. And so I think that's also how it impacts culture. And that's how it might help to change our culture and change our perspective on things. No, you.
Once again,
you saying?
You see these interesting themes like Hunger Games. In some ways, is about the ruling class and how everyone else is dealt with in this dystopian manner, or The Handmaid's Tale, and so these themes are embedded into a story, that we can kind of see a thread of, oh yeah, I recognize what's going on here. And so that's one of the things I think is so amazing about storytelling. Many of these stories are also coming from novels that have been adapted, and there's a lot of rich material in that to either create an episodic, like Game of Thrones type of thing, which came from, I believe, Fire and Ice. Handmaid's Tale has been hugely successful, even though that was written as a novel. So what advice would you give writers in terms of, where we're at today, in terms of anything you haven't already said, either about projects that you look at and how you make them better, your secret sauce in terms of how you make them more commercially viable?
I don't know that it's a secret sauce. I guess the advice that I would give to writers is start out with the bones of your story. Start out with who's your protagonist, what do they want, what happens if they don't get it, and who's trying to stop them. And that can be one paragraph long. I mean, it's not a long, drawn-out treatise. It's one paragraph, okay? And that becomes your Bible. That becomes your touchstone. That becomes what you follow in your story. And if you have that down, and if that has got some real-life experience behind it, and if that has got something that's happening in the zeitgeist, okay, that's something that can be powerful. Now, when you sit down and you start fleshing that out, you start fleshing out the characters and the subplots and all of those things, okay, that's a longer experience, okay? I like to write in stages. I like to write in layers. So I start out with that core paragraph, and then I'll do maybe a 4 or 5 page outline where I say, well, this happens in the beginning, and then this happens, and Jack and Jill will go up the hill, and then Jack falls down, Jill comes tumbling after, and you have a rough idea of the main things you're going to have your protagonist go through, and then you wind up with that 4 or 5 page document, and then you start layering on top of that when you go into the more detail and the finer points of your story. And I think at that point you come up with something that starts to have a shape and a life and a feel of its own, and it becomes, hey, this is real. This is a story about Jack. Who is he? What was he trying to do? And so, that to me is the key. And I think the one mistake that most first-time writers make is they fall in love with certain scenes. Okay, in their mind, when they think of their story, they fall in love with certain vignettes or scenes or actions that, oh yeah, the characters do this, or I see them walking on the beach or doing that. That's great, okay. But if it's not in service to the story, if it doesn't move the plot line forward in some way, shape, or form, then you need to seriously think about cutting it out. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's exposition. That's just that's just telling people what's going on. If you're a screenwriter, and I deal mostly with, I don't deal with novelists, I deal with people who are writing for the screen or for television or episodic.
Or adaptations, right? Adaptations.
Yeah, or adaptations of books. You need to have the ability to show it, not tell it. Okay,
right.
And so the long exposition is not really a good move, generally speaking. Okay, you can't afford to do that too much because then it just becomes a talking heads kind of thing, and that's the death of a film. You need activity, action, not necessarily Captain America kind of action, but you need movement. And a good example is like you look at Jason Bourne. He's always moving. He's always going someplace. He's always running from somebody or trying to accomplish something. There's not a lot of static conversation. I think that's important, that you have that show, don't tell kind of mentality, and you also have the ability to cut your own favorite scenes out and say, you know what,
kill
this
your
isn't
darling.
moving the story forward. Kill your darlings. Yep. You don't have, it's not moving the story forward, or it's maybe confusing, and so you have to cut it out. And that, quite honestly, in my experience, is one of the problems with adapting books. Books, when you take novels or books or things of that nature, there's a lot of interior thought, a lot of what the protagonist is doing. You understand from what they're thinking. It's easier and more prevalent in a book to say, here's what I'm thinking. But when you translate that into a movie, that's difficult because you can't have that interiority. You have to have it as action. You have to have it as conflict. You have to have it as
dialogue,
movement.
Yeah.
And dialogue, you got to limit the dialogue. It's not this big, two guys having coffee for 20 minutes. I mean, nobody really wants to see that in a movie. You want to have it, you want to have activity around it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, they're all great. And I think that what's interesting is that the spinal column that you lay out is very essential and basic, and yet oftentimes when I'm watching something, I say to myself, okay, I don't really get who's the protagonist and what do they want. And, you're 10 minutes into it, and that's already got to be kind of like shown and obvious to people to hook them, so to speak. And I do think, given that we are, and I mentioned this in the beginning, dealing with increasingly limited attention spans for many reasons, that, all of this information is even more, relevant and important than ever before.
You want to get the audience involved right away. And in a film, if it's going to be an hour and a half to 2 hours, you've got to get the audience involved. They've got to know who the protagonist is and what they want within the first, 7-10 minutes. If they don't know, if you're telling them a half hour in, it's like, oh boy, they've already checked out. They're gone. And I'm a big fan of actually looking at movies that you like, that appeal to you, that call out to you. What are the 5 movies that you like? Oh, I really like this movie. Watch it and apply that rule and see. I like to watch a movie when it has the timer on the bottom. So through Netflix or some of the other streaming services, where I can see, oh, here you go, 4 minutes into the film, I see the protagonist, I see the antagonist, I know what the issue is. Okay, and go to the ones you like and go to the ones you don't like, and you'll find that the ones you like pretty much follow that formula, and the ones you don't like pretty much don't follow that formula. And so, that to me is a really good way to do it. And also, if you're writing for film, watching how other people have handled it, have handled the same topic, how they've addressed it, because you can be telling a suspense movie, you can be telling a murder mystery, and you can be watching Alfred Hitchcock and Agatha Christie and people like that on television and say, here's how they handle this, and here's how they handle that. And you could borrow from the way some of the masters have handled. I'm not talking about lifting their scenes, but the perspective and the approach that they used in how they handled it. And so to me, that's equally as important.
Yeah, great advice. And I think that one other thing that I would add that I have this little quirk with is when I'm watching something and I don't see these elements, kind of coming to fruition right in the beginning, I'll usually will look it up on Wikipedia and see, okay, how much did the film make? And I'll usually see that it did not do well. So, these things translate into obviously how people respond to the film and does it get traction, all the things that you're talking about. Well,
and in today's world, taking 2 hours out of your life, and when you consider getting there and parking and whatever, 2-3 hours out of your life, it's a little bit of a significant commitment, and it's not inexpensive. It's $15 a ticket and plus whatever else you're buying. So, it's a real commitment to watch something, to be entertained. And a lot of times you see movies that are the cinematography is fabulous, the actors and actresses are great, they're properly cast, but it kind of leaves you a little flat, and you walk out and say, well, what the hell was that? And what that was, it's a poor story structure. You didn't really know what the guy wanted and who was trying to stop him, or if you did, it was kind of convoluted and it happened too far into it, and you lost me, after the first half hour. So, you can look at things like that and incorporate them into your own writing, which I think just makes you better.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and share your wisdom. And I just wanted to add that if anyone who's listening to this wants to take their writing to the next level, I would encourage them to visit my website, SkylarMadison.com, and also keep a lookout for workshops that I'm going to be doing. And Joe will be also participating in some of these workshops in Los Angeles. And if you're interested, you can sign up to receive more information. So thank you so much, Joe, and keep on keeping on.
The Creative Writer's Way.
To touch the reader inside is to tap into where we live. It is common to us all. It is unique to us all. Finding that path is the hero's journey. The journey begins with you.
This is Dr. Skylar Madison. Find your story at SkylarMadison.com.